In this lecture, we will discuss how to name different QRS complexes. Being able to name various QRS complexes is not difficult, but can often be a point of confusion. So here we're going to review some definitions and then do some practice. I don't think you'll have a problem after this. So again, starting here, we have a Q wave, which represents the first negative deflection after a P wave. Okay, so if we draw a complex here, okay, this being our P wave, this is our QRS complex. This is our T wave. We're saying that the Q wave is the first negative deflection of our QRS complex after the P wave. So this is our P wave. The first negative deflection is this. So this would be our Q wave. The R wave is defined as the first positive deflection after the P wave. So again, we have our P wave. The first positive deflection going upwards would be this. So this is our R wave. Then we have the S wave. The S wave is defined as the first negative deflection below baseline after the R wave. So this is our R wave, and we're saying the first negative deflection after our baseline. So if we have a baseline, let's draw this here. This would be our baseline, okay, that we're using our PR segment as. So below the baseline after the R wave would be our S wave. Okay, so those are the basic waves. As long as you know them, it shouldn't be too hard. Now, sometimes you'll see small letters used, not all the time, but if you do, there will be like a small q, small r, and small s, and those represent small amplitude of the deflections. Okay, that's all it represents. If you have more than one of the same wave, we call them prime waves. Okay, and if you have more than two or of that, we'll call it a double prime, and so forth. Okay, now if there's no R wave present, okay, so no positive deflection, we call it a QS complex. So let's now go through some of these examples. So look here, this is the first basic one. We'll start here and work our way over. So this is a QRS complex. The Q, the first negative deflection, notice it's small, so we put a small q, all right? Then we have a big R, the first positive deflection, all right? Imagine we have a P wave before each one of these. This is our P wave, so this is the R wave, and then we have the S wave, so we call that a QRS with a small q in the beginning, okay? Next we have a complex that does not have an R wave. So if you imagine, again, we put in a P wave here, we have no positive deflection after it. Instead, it goes straight down, okay, like a Q wave. But we said if there's no R wave present, okay, we call that a QS complex. So this is a QS complex, and this is a Q wave that we see there, okay, so named as a QS complex. Next, we have one here. So let's go up here. We're going to look at a P wave in the beginning, okay, then we have our QRS. Notice we have a positive deflection, so that's an R wave, okay. The next deflection does not go below our baseline, right? We said our baseline would be this. It stays above it, all right, and instead we have another R prime, or R wave, so we call that an R prime. So this complex is known as an R prime complex. If we move to the right, we see another R prime complex. Again, we have our P wave before, okay? And then we have the first complex is positive going upwards, small r because of the small amplitude of it, but it's still an R wave. And then we have another R wave after. Notice that negative deflection does not go below baseline, so we don't call it an S wave, okay? Some people will call it an RSR prime if we see in a right bundle branch block, but if you want to be technical, it's not exactly an S wave, okay? It never goes below baseline. And then the next wave goes again upwards. So that's another R wave, so we call it R prime. So this is a small R prime complex. Next, we'll move down here. We have, again, another R prime complex, but notice it's a little different from the previous one. Again, let's imagine we have our P wave coming before it. Then we have a positive deflection, so this is an R wave, okay? The one after it does not go below our baseline here, so again, it's not an S wave, all right? And next, notice again, in all these, we have no Q wave present, right? There's no negative deflection. Okay, so if anything, if this were to go below baseline, that would be an S wave and not a Q wave, because we're seeing the S wave is the first negative deflection after the R wave, okay, not after the P wave. So then this next complex here, again, another R wave, still pretty big in amplitude, so we call this an R prime complex, okay. Now we're coming to one where we have, let's draw our P wave here. okay? Then we have an R wave going positive, okay? Positive deflections are R wave, so we'll put an R. Then we have the next wave. This one is going below baseline, right? Here's our baseline, and this one is going below it. We call that an S wave. So we put an RS, and then the next one goes above baseline again, and then we have this positive deflection known as an R prime, okay? Again, this is not a Q wave, okay, because it is coming after the R wave, all right? That's commonly mistaken, but again, this is an S wave, so we call it an RS, R prime. Next we have our last complex where we have our P wave present, okay? We go through the PR segment, we give a positive deflection upwards first, so we put an R. Then this one goes below baseline, okay, but we have a small S wave, so this one here. So we'll put a small s, and then it goes back above baseline. So we call this an R prime because it's the second R wave. And then notice we go back below baseline for another S wave, the second S wave, so we call it an S prime. So this is an RS, R prime, S prime complex, okay? So again, hopefully this makes sense. Now let's briefly review what we discussed before we end. So again, the Q wave is the first negative deflection after the P wave. Notice in a lot of these examples, we didn't see that, all right? But remember, if you see this complex here, this first negative deflection, that is a Q wave, okay? Next, we talked about the R wave. This is the first positive deflection after the P wave, okay? We saw a lot of those. Then the S wave is the first negative deflection below that baseline after the R wave, okay? We use small letters to imply that the amplitude of these deflections was small, okay? You don't always see that when people use them, but that's technically correct. And then we have, if it's more than one complex, okay, of the same wave, we call those primes. We saw where we had two R waves, so we call it an R prime complex. We saw this where it was an RS-R prime complex there. Okay, and then so forth. And lastly, we said if there's no R wave, as we saw here, so there's no positive deflection, we call this a QS complex. Well, that's the end of this lecture. I hope this is starting to make sense and you're able to name these on your own. So we just looked at all these definitions of the QRS complex, and hopefully you're able to learn that and be able to name them on your own. I hope you learned something.